So we are delighted to have today with us in our Bar-Ilan University Vision Science Seminar, Professor Bianca van Kemenade from Justus Liebig University in Gießen. Professor van Kemenade has a BSc from University College Utrecht, where she majored in cognitive neuroscience and biomedical sciences and minored in psychology. She has a dual master's in brain and mind sciences that she did at UCL's Institute of Neurology, as well at École Normale Supérieure and Université Pierre and Marie Curie in Paris. She did her PhD at the Berlin School of Mind and Brain, which is part of the Humboldt Universität zu Berlin, and this was under the supervision of professors Philipp Sturzer, Felix Blankenburg, and John Dillon Haynes. After her PhD, she continued to a postdoc working with Professors Philipp Sturzer. She then did another postdoc at the Philipps University Marburg with Professors Thilo Kircher and Benjamin Straub. I hope I'm pronouncing all these names correctly. This was followed by another postdoc at the University of Glasgow, where she worked with Lars Muckli on her DFG fellowship. Several years ago, she joined the Center for Psychiatry at Justus Liebig University in Gießen, where she's now faculty. She's the head of the Systems Neuroscience Actions and Perception Lab, or in short, SNAP Lab. Her research focuses on questions regarding perception and action, multisensory integration, and predictive coding. For example, her lab is interested in how we distinguish self-generated and externally generated stimuli. How do our actions influence our perception and neural processing? And how might problems with these mechanisms be involved in schizophrenia? To investigate these questions, her lab uses fMRI, TMS, and other behavioral methods. So we'd like to welcome you, Bianca, to our seminar. We are delighted to have you here today with us to share your interesting research, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sharon, for this lovely introduction. Thanks also for inviting me. It's really wonderful to be part of this really great seminar series. I'll just start to share my screen. There we go. Exactly, yes. So as you mentioned, I will be talking about how we predict and perceive sensory consequences of our own action. And with sensory outcomes of our own action, I literally mean any type of stimulus that is the direct result of our own action. And to illustrate what kind of processes are going on when we perform actions, I just want to start with a very basic example that we have in our daily life. We just reach for a coffee cup, we take a sip, we put it back, right? Exactly, perfect demonstration. So there's several processes here that we'd like to highlight that I will talk about. So first of all, we of course need to make a sort of a movement plan to reach our goal. And while doing so, we might realize that we're sort of, deviating a little bit from the intended path. So we have to use online feedback from our action to then correct for this movement. So this detection is important. And then secondly, while we perform these actions, we also generate lots of stimuli. So for example, while we move our hand forward, we might sort of like have our sleeve sort of like move around our arm that creates some kind of tactile sensation on our skin. Or when we put the cup back, we also produce a sound. And these are stimuli that we might not have necessarily intended, but they're also really highly predictable. And we might want to spend less resources on processing these because we are generating stimuli really all the time when we make any type of movement. So it might cost us a lot of resources. So we might actually want to suppress these. And then we might also want to determine who caused these kinds of stimuli. It's actually really important if we want to create any sensible understanding of our environment, that we are able to understand the relationship between our actions and the outcome. So if we're in a cafe, for example, we might hear lots of similar sounds of people putting their cup back. How do I know actually that that is my sound and not what someone else produced? So a little bit of the self-other distinction I will also touch upon here. Now, when I started working in this field, of course, it didn't start from scratch. There's been already lots of work on this. And from all this previous work, we know that indeed we tend to suppress stimuli that we cause ourselves. So this is some classic work from Sarah Jane Blakemore showing that in the tactile domain, for example, when we produce the tactile stimulus ourselves, we tend to perceive this as less intense, so we're less ticklish when we do it ourselves. And it's not just a perceptual phenomenon, we also see that it leads to less neuroactivity in the brain. And this phenomenon has really been replicated many times and is not just specific to the tactile domain. There's also evidence for auditory suppression and to some extent also in the visual domain. And secondly, what we also know from previous studies is that this seems to be related to very specific predictions about spatial and temporal aspects. So for example, when you start to introduce delays between the movement and the feedback, that's when we start to see that this attenuation is reduced. So in this example here, more delay meant that at some point the self-generated tactile stimuli are less ticklish until at some point they're just equally ticklish as an externally generated one. And the same goes when you introduce a spatial deviation. So for example, a rotation between the movement and how your hand is being touched. So this already indicates we have some kind of specific predictions here that lead to this attenuation, and deviations will reduce this attenuation. So this has already then also then been put into some kind of model that explains all these phenomena, the forward model that suggests that when we perform actions, we of course, first of all, need a motor command that we send to our muscles, but at the same time, we also have this copy of the motor command and the efference copy that we use to generate predictions about the sensory outcomes of this action using in a forward model. And these predictions then have to be compared with the actual sensory feedback. That's what's happening here in this comparator process. When we have a match here, we see this typical suppression effect, but when there's a mismatch, we instead need to generate some kind of prediction error that goes back into the system. And this is very useful also for motor learning. For example, when we want to learn new skills, we need to detect these deviations from our intended goal so that we can update our predictions. So as I said, already lots of work that has been done before us. When we started working on this, we were actually specifically interested in multisensory predictions. Because up to this point, most of these effects had been studied only in separate modalities in isolation, which is not necessarily always reflecting reality. So a lot of actions are actually leading to multisensory consequences. So yeah, if I snap my fingers, for example, which also relates nicely to the Snap Lab name, I create, of course, multisensory action outcomes. So I don't only create sounds, I also create tactile input on my fingers, I create differences, shifts on the retina when I look at my moving hand, etc. So we were wondering, how does the forward model create such multisensory predictions, or does it even do that in the first place? So in this first fMRI study, we had kind of a simple paradigm. There was just a cue to tell people to get ready for the trial. And then they had to perform an action, which in this case was a simple button press. And then we presented feedback of this button press with a variable delay. This feedback could either be just a very simple circle on the screen, or it could be just a simple sine wave beep, or it could be both. And people were asked to detect delays between action and feedback. Here, crucially, we had different blocks. So in visual blocks, people were asked to focus on the visual modality and report delays only for the visual stimulus. And in auditory ones, they had to report delays in the auditory domain. And in these cases, the stimuli could either be unimodal or bimodal. So it could be that in the visual block, there is a visual stimulus and an auditory one, but you just have to focus on the visual one and vice versa. And in passive cases, we have the same stimuli, but they are presented automatically. Now, if we want to look at suppression, what we want to compare is, of course, these passive and active conditions. And when we do this, what we saw here is very clear suppression in relevant sensory areas. So we saw this reduced bold signal for active conditions. What was most special about this particular result is that this is actually a conjunction analysis across all conditions. That means that we see the same pattern here in both the unimodal and bimodal conditions. meaning that if you press the button and there was, for example, only a visual outcome, we saw suppression not only in visual cortex, but also auditory cortex, and the other way around, even if in the end there was only a unimodal outcome. So that sort of seems to suggest, well, the brain is prepared to process action outcomes of all possible modalities, sort of an indication of maybe a multisensory prediction. So you're suppressing both, even if in the end the stillness was just only in a single modality. Now, then related to this, we were wondering, does that then also mean that we have a supramodal comparator? So one comparator that does compare the predictions for all the different sensory modalities, which would make sense. Like, why should we need several different comparator areas? Makes sense if there is one. But this was not quite clear and also not quite clear where it was. So we used these data and then did a parametric modulation, which means that we are looking for brain areas where the activity correlates positively with delay. And that means larger delay is more activity. So we're looking for an area that sort of signals these prediction areas. If there's a bigger deviation, I have more activity. And here the key finding was that in this conjunction analysis, we see that we have this area here in the parietal lobe, the angular gyrus, that showed this correlation here for both the visual and the auditory modality. So this suggests that in this particular region, we have this supramodal comparator process going on. So it detects delays in both the different sensory modalities. Now, so far so good. We thought, okay, that's really interesting, but how do we know if this is really specific to the efference copy? The problem in this study is that our passive condition was very passive, as in you just didn't do anything. You just looked at the screen and waited for the stimuli to appear. And that is, of course, a bit different from performing an actual action. So the problem here is then that we have two types of mismatches. One mismatch is the one that we are interested in, that is the mismatch between prediction and outcome. The other mismatch is then a mismatch between the senses. So when I press a button, I of course also have tactile information from pressing the button and proprioceptive information. And then if then the visual stimulus, for example, comes a bit later, I also just have a mismatch between these sensory informations. And that is, of course, then something that's not there in the passive condition. So we wanted to then try to sort of isolate the role of the efference copy. For that, we had to go through the trouble of creating a setup that is MR compatible, not always easy. We ended up with this device here that we call our passive movement device. So this is a handle that you can either move actively yourself with just a wrist movement, or the device moves your hand for you. It works through air pressure here, so it can go into the scanner. There's no metal or no electricity involved in this case. And our attempt here was to have a more similar passive condition. So now in both active and passive conditions, there is an actual movement taking place. You also have similar tactile and proprioceptive information. So the only difference here is really whether you intended to move, yes or no. So we had this in the scanner. It's probably a bit hard to see, but there's a person here in the scanner and they have this device basically lying next to them. And then what we did is that we recorded these hand movements with this MR compatible camera, high-speed camera that we placed above it so that we could provide real-time feedback of pupil's own hand. And so that we could also manipulate this image. So first of all, we needed this image because you can't really see your hand if you're lying in a scanner. That's one. But also we wanted to make all sorts of manipulations with the images. So we had a paradigm that's very similar to what you've seen before. Again, after a cue, people perform an action. Now this time the action is with the actual device. The feedback is always this recording of the hand. In some cases, we also had a tone, although that's now a bit less relevant for what I will talk about. And again, people had to detect the delay between their action and the visual feedback that they saw on the screen. So now we can also look at behavioral effects because in both the active and passive cases, we have a movement and feedback that is either delayed or not delayed. So we can plot these psychometric functions here, see how well people detect delays. And what we see here in the active condition is here the solid line. You see that here the curve's a little bit shifted to the right. So people need more delay before they detect it in the active condition. So there's a worse delay detection performance here, sort of resembling maybe a bit of this suppression effect. Although I'm aware that this is a temporal task, it's not an intensity judgment task. So it's maybe not quite the same, but at least we see here also a worse performance here in the active condition. Now, what do we see in the brain? So here we are again interested in these comparator processes. So that means we are again doing this parametric modulation analysis. We're trying to see which area sort of scales up with the amount of delay. When we first do this across conditions, we see an area that you might have seen before, right? The angular gyrus here is popping up again. It's now extending a little bit also to these temporal areas. So here again, these areas are detecting delays, but they are doing this in both the active and the passive condition. Now we can actually isolate what is specific to the active condition and when we contrast these conditions. And here we see that now the cerebellum pops up. Here the cerebellum detects delays only in the active condition, but not the passive condition. So first, that was an interesting distinction here. So it suggests that what we saw in the previous study in the angular gyrus is maybe not specific for action. So it seems that what instead was happening here is that the angular gyrus detected these mismatches between the senses. So this sort of feeling like, okay, I feel my hand is moving and then I see that it's moving a little bit later. There is a mismatch. This is a mismatch that is there in both the active and the passive condition. So it seems that these areas are sort of detecting these general mismatches, whereas the cerebellum is really specifically doing this comparator process for voluntary action using the efference copy. So that is what we could sort of disentangle with this study and showing that there are these two different processes at play in different brain areas. So now that we had this cool setup, of course, we wanted to do a little bit more with this. For example, we were wondering what the role of hand identity is. And with hand identity, I mean like these visual features that tell me that this is my hand. So of course, the efference copy signals a very strong indicator that I am the one who moved. On the other end, of course, we have all these visual features that tell me, oh, this is actually my hand and not someone else's hand. So we were interested in seeing how these two processes are interacting with each other. So this is work that was led by Lucas Ullmann, who did his PhD on this topic. So we had, again, very similar paradigm here, but now the feedback was sometimes of your own hand and sometimes of someone else's hand. Here, of course, we had to take great care that the other condition did not have any deviation. So if you would just play a movie from someone else's hand, there would always be some kind of mismatch maybe between your own movement and that video if it's not quite properly aligned. So we made some upgrades in our device here. We have these optic cables now here with which we could detect exactly where in space the handle was so that we could then link it to specific frames in the video. So that means that if a participant was maybe moving a little bit fast, that video would also just be faster. And if you were moving slower, it was also slower. So it was quite linked. And I have a video here that sort of illustrates this process. So normally, of course, this curtain was closed, so you didn't actually see your own hand. This was our behavioral training setup. So normally you don't see your own hand. This is just for the video. And you'll see some of these passive trials where the device is doing the work. So that was one condition where you see your own hand on the screen. Here you should have seen a very obvious delay between the movement and what you see on the screen. And now you'll see someone else's hand. And you can see it's quite linked to the movement. There's not really any delay here, so it follows the movement quite well. And this will be with a very big delay. Exactly. So that's what it would look like for someone. Behavior speaking, everything is still very similar to what we had before. We again have this worse delay detection performance in the active condition. It doesn't really matter which hand you're seeing. So this is, yeah, no surprises here. What is interesting now that in the brain, we see actually an interaction effect between the source of the action. So if it's an active or passive condition and which hand you were seeing. Specifically, we see that there is more suppression for when you see your own hand compared to the other hand, specifically in these areas. One of which you should be familiar with by now. This is again the angular gyrus. It's also an area that is very well known for signaling non-agency. So basically, every time people feel that they're not in control of their own action, usually this area lights up. And what we can see here is that it does take hand identity into account. So all these graphs here on the side, they're very similar. They have a similar pattern. So I can just take any of these to explain the pattern. So you see here for the self condition where you see your own hand, there's this very clear differentiation between the active and the passive condition. So you have this clear suppression for the active condition. But in the other hand condition, you don't see this effect. So they're very similar. So it seems as if the angular gyrus is not only using reference copy signals, but it's also signaling whether this is really my own hand or not. That is reflected in these interactions here. Next step for us was then to see how does this work in patients with schizophrenia. So there's lots of evidence that patients with schizophrenia have some dysfunction in this efference copy mechanism. They tend to show less suppression of self-generated stimuli. So that's an indicator that there must be something that is going wrong in this whole action feedback monitoring. And there's also the idea that maybe this reduced suppression is partly causing their symptoms. So maybe if they don't suppress their own action outcomes, maybe that's why they tend to have these self-other distinction problems that they feel externally controlled. So now we're also wondering, okay, what about this interaction again between agency and hand identity? So this was again with Lucas Ullmann and now also Marijke Paetsen who joined this endeavor. So we had the same paradigm as what I showed you before, but now in healthy people and patients with schizophrenia. Here you see some behavioral results. On top here is the healthy participants. It's a different sample than the last, but you see the same results. Again, worse delayed detection performance in the active condition in both self and other. Nothing surprising here, so it's just a replication of that. Now here on the bottom, you see the patient data, and you already see that something interesting is happening here. So when the other person's hand is shown, they show the same effect as the healthy people. But when their own hand was shown, the delay detection performance is the same for active and passive conditions. So somehow there is no differentiation here when patient's own hand was shown. That's already quite interesting, I would say. What we then see in the brain is the following. So we first here show basically the effects of what we here called agency. So just again, the passive versus active effects. So here in the bright blue, you see the effect for the healthy people, and here in purple for the patients. What you first of all see is that in healthy people, you see this really widespread network of suppression in the active condition. This might seem quite large compared to that first study, but actually with our passive movement device, we tend to get a larger network of suppression here, possibly also because it's maybe just in general more of this surprise effects when your hand is being moved in a passive condition. You probably have a little bit more activity here in general. So this is a network that we replicate a lot. But you can already see just from overlapping these results that the network in the patients is much smaller here. That shows the suppression effect. Statistically speaking, it's mostly pronounced in the angular gyrus again, where we see group differences. So here in the angular gyrus, what we see in healthy people, again, we see this differentiation between the active and passive condition, but not in patients. When we now look at own hand versus other hand, we see that patients and controls are actually showing very similar effects. So here in the angular gyrus, you see that both groups here show overlapping results. We see that both in the healthy people and in the patient, there's a differentiation between own hand and other hand. So this seems to be actually surprisingly similar in patients. So for us, this sort of suggests that the angular gyrus, the activity here is modulated by both efference copy and hand identity in healthy controls, but it's only modulated by hand identity in patients and not by the efference copy. So it seems that patients have trouble with these internal signals, these sort of predictive signals, this is somehow not working the same way, but instead they might rely more on external signals, so these visual features. So this differentiation seems to be intact in the patient. So again, sort of providing more evidence for this idea. It's more about these predictive signals, these internal signals that are somehow working differently in patients. Okay, so I think time for a little interim summary of what we've seen up to this point. So in this part of the talk, I tried to sort of map some parts of the forward model onto the brain, specifically everything related to these comparator processes. So from other studies that I didn't mention, we of course know that this controller is mostly in motor regions. We've seen now that the cerebellum functions as a comparator area in this forward model, so it specifically uses the reference copy here to make this match between prediction and outcome. We see some evidence for multisensory prediction, where we have attenuation in all the relevant sensory cortices. We've seen that there's also some kind of sensory mismatch process going on. So mismatch detection between the senses that is more in these temporal-parietal areas that seems to be separate from this reference copy specific comparator process. And then the angular gyrus seems to also be specifically relevant for self-other distinction. So I already mentioned that previous studies have also shown it's very much involved in judgment of agency, where if you feel that you're not in control, this is the area that's lighting up. And we've seen also that indeed it also takes these visual features of hand identity into account. And lastly, patients with schizophrenia show dysfunctional reference copy mechanisms, but this processing of hand identity seems to be preserved. So far, that's what we've been looking at when we talk about these deviations between prediction and outcome, and sort of a little bit also how this reflects self-other distinction. And on the next part of my talk, I would like to focus a little bit more on the effects of perception directly. So basically scratching all these deviations that we insert between action and outcome. Just literally, if I produce a stimulus, how do I process this stimulus? And why is it differently from any other type of stimulus? So from the forward model, we would say, well, if there's a match between prediction and sensory feedback, we should see suppression. So our question here was, well, what does this suppression really look like on the neural level? What does it mean to suppress such a stimulus? Most of the studies so far usually talk about this in some form of cancellation or dampening, as it sometimes is called, which would just basically mean in an active condition, when you produce a stimulus yourself, we just see less activity compared to an identical stimulus that is somehow externally generated. And usually a lot of evidence can be seen in the form of, for example, in EEG studies, where you just have a smaller ERP for stimuli that are self-generated, or in fMRI studies where you just see a lower bold response. So there are lots of studies of this that all supporting this general sort of like cancellation or dampening approach. But there are several other theories out there that suggest that some processes might look like cancellation, but they are slightly different. So one of these is the so-called sharpening idea, which means that, yes, there is suppression, but it's a selective suppression only for neurons that are sort of tuned away from specific stimulus features. So maybe if you, for example, talk about an orientation, there are some neurons that prefer this orientation, and the further away you go, like the less preferred this is. So maybe in terms of sharpening, you might have suppression only in those neurons that are not really tuned to this specific orientation. So if you were to smooth over this brain area in some univariate fMRI analysis and just look at the area in general, it might look like suppression, but actually there is a sharpening going on. And this is based on some early work here from Peter Koch and colleagues, for example, that was a study had nothing to do with action. It was all just about predictions. But they showed that if you have a grading with an expected or an unexpected orientation, the results differ depending on how you analyze the data. So if you perform just a standard univariate analysis with fMRI, you see this typical expectation suppression. But if instead you use a classification approach where you train a classifier to discriminate between these stimuli, you actually see better decoding performance. And there's some evidence for this also in the action domain, where it's been shown that self-generated stimuli follow a similar pattern. So stimuli that are congruent with the action also show again bold suppression, but better decoding accuracy compared to incongruent ones. But there's not really been a direct comparison of active and passive conditions. So we don't really know if this is really what could explain these differences. So that's one alternative. Then there's also the pre-activation idea that would suggest that if you perform an action, you already pre-activate neurons that code for this stimulus outcome. So you have an earlier activation, and that's what looks like suppression if you, of course, look later on, because you just had an earlier rise of the bold response. There's also some evidence, of course, also for already some pre-activation. Here, for example, where you can see already like a stronger readiness potential if your action is also leading to a sound versus if it's only an action without a sound or the sound itself. We also had some reanalysis of our own data where we modeled the temporal derivatives of the bold response, and you could actually see, okay, well, actually, indeed, the bold response in the active condition is sort of shifted forward a little bit, it's a little bit earlier. So maybe that's what is explaining the later suppression that you see during the actual stimulus. So that's option 3. And then we have a fourth option, that is the opposing process theory, that was suggested, that actually says the origin of the prediction doesn't matter. It shouldn't matter if it's an active or a passive prediction. All that matters is if the stimulus is expected or unexpected. So this means, according to this theory, like if we have a prediction about a certain sensory stimulus, we do have some pre-activation. We activate those neurons that are coding for the stimulus. And later on, when the actual stimulus comes, what might happen is if the stimulus is actually unexpected, that we highlight the stimulus so that we can have more resources to process this stimulus. But this also suggests that, as I said, all that matters is really the actual prediction itself. It shouldn't matter if it's based on an efference copy or based on something else. So that also should suggest that if active and passive conditions are very predictable, the effect should look very similar. So you should just see pre-activation in both cases, and you should just see very similar processing later on. So 4 different ideas of what action might do on the neural level. And that's what we wanted to then test in this study. So we had here active and passive conditions. This time the passive condition was again just the stimulus comes automatically. We had here tones that would predict the overall orientation of gratings that were presented later on. And then first, for a while, nothing happened. So you already had a prediction about what stimulus will come later on, but nothing is on the screen yet. And then after this cue, in the active condition, you press the button that you learned that was associated here. So you would learn, for example, the index finger leads to a leftward grating and the middle finger to a rightward grating, for example, or vice versa. In the passive condition, you did not press and everything came automatically. And the stimulus was always a pair of 2 consecutive gratings that both had the same overall orientation, so the same overall predicted orientation, but they differed very slightly, and you had to just judge if the second stimulus was oriented clockwise or counterclockwise compared to the first one. So an orientation discrimination task. So people would do both a behavioral version of this experiment, then they would do this in the scanner, and then they came back also for retinotopy and localizer, because we wanted to really specifically look in early visual cortex to see how the sensory processing of these stimuli is altered by action. We performed a univariate and multivariate analysis to look at these different aspects of the bold response, and we did this separately for the preparatory phase and for the stimulus phase. So behaviorally speaking, actually not much is going on, surprisingly. So we plotted the psychometric functions and derived the thresholds and slopes, and also calculated overall accuracy, but it didn't really matter what measure you looked at. there's just no difference in orientation discrimination performance between active and passive conditions. We replicate this effect also for using the data that was collected during the fMRI experiment. So very similar results here. In the brain, what we see here, first of all, when we do a standard univariate analysis, is that in the preparatory phase, there is no difference between active and passive conditions. So there's no real evidence for a specific pre-activation that's only happening in the active condition or more in the active condition than the passive condition. During the stimulus phase, so when the stimuli are actually presented, we do see a significant effect here, but in maybe an opposite effect than we would have expected because there's actually a higher bold response in the active condition. So we actually see an enhancement here. And this is also what you can see here when we perform this deconvolution GLM. So with this, we are not making any assumptions about the HRF. So we try to be more sensitive for maybe small differences in timing here. But it basically showed very similar results. You see here on the peak here, very clear boost basically for the active condition. You also see that the bold response rises in a very similar way. There's not really an earlier rise of the bold response in the active condition. And in terms of pre-activation, there's in the beginning no difference, and later on, if anything, actually the opposite effect, that there's a little bit more sustained response for the passive, but not for the active. So what do our multivariate results show? So here we trained the classifier to discriminate between leftward and rightward gratings so that we could identify sharpening effects. So maybe if there's maybe better decoding for one condition or the other. This is what we find here again in early visual cortex specifically. So we can decode the stimuli when the stimuli are presented. Well, that's no surprise. That should, of course, be a given, but that's a good sanity check. Here, interestingly, actually, in the preparatory phase, we can also decode the upcoming stimuli. And that's quite nice because there was actually no stimulus on the screen yet. All people had was their prediction about what stimulus would come. So we can decode this. That's nice. But what is interesting here is that there is no difference between active and passive conditions. So no sharpening going on in any of these conditions, very similar. So to then provide more evidence that it's really a very similar process, we also did cross-classification, meaning we trained on the active condition and tested on the passive, and also vice versa. And here we actually obtained very similar results. So you can train on one condition and test on the other condition, suggesting that these patterns are really very similar because the pattern generalizes to the other condition. So that provides some more evidence that this really seems to be a very similar mechanism here. So what does this mean for all these theories that we had? Well, these data are actually not really providing any evidence for the cancellation because we saw actually an enhancement. We also did not see any sharpening in our data, nor pre-activation, as in, yes, we did see pre-activation, but we saw it for both the active and the passive condition. So there's not a specific effect here only for the active condition. That leaves us with this opposing process theory. So I say there's partial support for this theory. So we do see indeed that both the active and passive conditions led to a pre-activation. So our predictions here do pre-activate neurons in early visual cortex. That is in line with this theory. What is not in line, of course, is that we had this enhancement later on going on during the actual stimulus. So actually the theory would predict that this is only happening if the stimulus was unexpected. But in our case, all conditions were super predictable. There was 100% validity of the cue and of the buttons. No surprises here. So there should not have been any difference here. Leaves the question if there's maybe some non-specific process going on, maybe just the fact that you have to perform an action is a little bit more increasing your arousal or attention. It could be one idea. There's several other options that we can discuss. So I would say it's partly in line, not completely. And of course, to further provide evidence for this theory, we should also include in the next study unexpected stimuli as well. So here everything was just very predictable, very expected. So we cannot completely say if this is really what's going on here. And also, I want to highlight that I am not rejecting any of these theories with our data. I don't think we can with this data, and I also don't think that this is the case. I think there's maybe lots of reasons to think that the effects that we found are very specific for our setup. For example, a lot of previous studies did not have an actual behavioral task. So often people just have to press buttons. They have to perceive the stimuli but not do anything with them. Whereas in our case, they had to do this demanding task that might already have changed a lot of things. Could be that you only see this cancellation if the stimuli are completely not relevant for your task, right? So that's already one option where maybe that is explaining some of the discrepancies. Could also have something to do with the temporal predictability. We kept everything very predictable. Maybe normally action sort of makes your prediction a bit more clear or like more precise, because normally externally generated stimuli are not as predictable, perhaps. So there's lots of reasons to think that these theories could still apply in certain cases. So I just want to say that only the current data are not necessarily providing evidence for this. Doesn't mean that there's no evidence for these at all. I think we just should do more studies to figure out what's exactly going on and what are the sort of the edge cases where one or the other theory applies. So just trying to say things are more complicated maybe than it initially seemed. Right. Then I just want to spend a little bit more time also on this suppression versus enhancement debate. So you might think, well, our study is the odd one out that shows enhancement and all the other studies show suppression. Actually, that's indeed not the case. We're not alone. Many studies indeed show suppression. I presented these two examples to you, but there are, of course, many more in the literature. But there's actually also quite some studies showing enhancement. I mean, I saw Roy in the audience, like he has several studies on auditory effects that always show that there is more bold response or better performance for the auditory condition for the active case. And there's several other studies, like more than I can put on the slide, showing that there's an enhancement as well. So, of course, that raised the question, what's really going on? Why is action sometimes suppressing and sometimes enhancing? A look in the literature actually showed that maybe indeed it's not just an all or nothing effect. Maybe there is actually a more dynamic modulation of sensory sensitivity. There's a few factors that I think could be relevant. So, for example, here, this is an example from some colleagues of mine in Gießen that showed that tactile suppression during a movement is actually indeed not a straight line. It's not always constant. They actually showed that this suppression is almost completely gone at the time point of the highest movement speed, which coincidentally is also the time point where maybe you need all this sensory information the most to guide your action. So already showing it's not always constant. Another example is that maybe the action goal is relevant. So there are some studies showing that orientation discrimination performance actually improves when the goal of your action is to use that information. So if you just have to do an open reach versus really align your hand with that orientation, this aligning, for example, actually improves the orientation discrimination performance and also leads to better decoding in the brain. So maybe also the goal of the action is relevant here. And lastly, also the quality of the stimulus is important as well. So here, again, from Roy's group, from Daniel Resnick, showing that tones that are the outcome of your action, if they are presented clearly above threshold, you see the classical suppression effect. But if they are presented really near your hearing threshold, when it's hard to hear them, this effect flips and you get actually an enhancement. This has been replicated by some other studies as well. So in this study, we were particularly interested in this stimulus quality effect. And we were wondering, does this also apply to the visual domain? This really goes then more in the direction of, is it really for a model still, or is it more going in the direction of this Bayesian or predictive coding idea, where sometimes if stimuli are very noisy, you actually use your predictions to sort of improve your perception or bias your perception. And here's such an example where if you see this stimulus, you might think, oh, this blob here is a car and this blob here is a pedestrian, but it's just your prior expectation that this is a street scene because actually these two blobs are exactly the same. They're just 90 degrees rotated. So you really use your predictions here. So we wanted just to test, okay, is there an effect of stimulus visibility that could shed some light on the effects of action in the visual domain. So here we had gratings that were either high visibility or they were embedded in noise. We used also staircase procedure to individually titrate which noise level we should use for each person. And we again had active and passive conditions. So this paradigm is very similar to what we had before. Now we just have 4 different conditions: active, passive, and high and low visibility. And we don't have this preparatory phase anymore. So we just directly ask people to press after this cue. But other than that, very similar to what we had before. Again, also behavioral and fMRI, and we also used univariate and multivariate analyses. Now, behavior, now we see actually some interesting results. So, I mean, the main effect of visibility is not very surprising. Of course, you're worse if the stimuli are noisy, sure. But there's also main effect of action. So people tend to be a little bit better in the active condition. The interaction did not quite reach significance, but there's a trend for it showing that there's a little bit more improvement in the low visibility condition. And this is some preliminary results. It's still ongoing work. But what we see here in the brain is that we indeed have actually an enhancement effect. So no suppression, but an enhancement effect, specifically also in visual cortex. And there's a region in visual cortex that shows here an interaction where their enhancement is particularly pronounced when stimulus visibility is low. So again, going this similar direction from the auditory domain, where it's like you mostly see an enhancement if it's really hard to see, basically. Multivariate results are also still work in progress, but what we see, at least at first glimpse, is that again, main effect of visibility, that is not surprising. You can decode a little bit worse if stimuli are noisy. That's also not surprising. But here, actually, there's no effect of action or an interaction with action, and that's actually already quite a clear null effect here. So there's no specific sharpening here going on. So interim conclusion of this study is that action can improve orientation discrimination performance. It can indeed also lead to enhancement, and specifically when stimulus visibility is low, but only in terms of amplitude of neuroactivity, not in terms of precision here in terms of decoding. So action can boost the amplitude, but not precision of neural responses, which is then also modulated by stimulus visibility. Right. In the last few minutes, I just want to talk a little bit about some new work that we're doing right now on trying to relate how action then relates to these sort of hallucinatory like percepts and how it relates to subclinical symptoms. So here I want to talk about false percepts. And by that, I don't mean clinical hallucinations. I just mean some kind of percept that we might all have sometimes in daily life. For example, you think your phone vibrated and then you check there's actually no message. So you just had a false alarm, basically. And that's then interesting because we can, of course, experiment induce these, or we can test these in signal detection paradigms where people might have, might just report having perceived something even though there was nothing there. There was just noise and no signal. And this is interesting because patients with schizophrenia also tend to report more false alarms in such tasks than healthy people. But also within healthy people, you see really quite a lot of variation. And you see that even people who don't have diagnoses, just a little bit of how they vary in terms of subclinical symptoms also shows a correlation with false alarms. So here are some examples. These are all people without any diagnosis, but it can happen in the general population as well, that some people sometimes hear a voice, it doesn't disturb them, they go on with their life happily, but they do sometimes hear voices. And you can see here also that false alarm rates are indeed highest for those who experience such hallucinations weekly, as compared to less frequent hallucinations or no hallucinations. You can also use questionnaires for this, where there's also correlations between how high you score on such questionnaires and how high your false alarm rate is, or indeed how confident you are in those false alarms. So just showing that this is an interesting paradigm that you can use in these cases. And in this last study, we were interested in 2 questions. So this was done by Carlo Cobato, who's doing his PhD right now in my lab. And we were wondering, considering this previous result that action can sometimes boost perception, and specifically when stimuli are noisy. Could it be that action sometimes boosts a bit too much and you start to see things that aren't really there? You have sort of these false alarms. And secondly, how do we then relate this to these subclinical symptoms? Because on the one hand, we have this whole theory of the forward model and efference copy dysfunctions. On the other hand, there's also a whole literature out there that maybe psychosis or hallucinations are related to just general deficits in prediction, sort of a problem with the weighting of sensory evidence versus priors, and that is not specific to action. So, second question we were wondering about is, can this relation between false alarms and in our case schizotypy be explained by the efference copy, or is it a more general thing that is going on here? So we had a very simple signal detection paradigm. You either had just noise, or there was a signal embedded in noise in the form of a grating. This noise was, by the way, not static. It was really it was refreshed on each frame. So it looked a bit like the static on an old TV. And as I said, sometimes the signal was hidden here. A very simple paradigm where people are just asked, did you see a grating? Yes or no, and how confident were you? And they either caused the stimulus themselves with a button press, or it was presented automatically. In terms of signal detection, we actually have a very clear effect of action. So there are more false alarms reported when people cause the stimulus themselves. And this seemed surprisingly not to be a perceptual effect because there was no change in D prime. Instead, it was all a change in response bias. So people became much more liberal in the active condition and much more likely to say, yes, I think I saw something in the active condition. We also saw that it correlated with their schizotypy score. So higher scores on this questionnaire also was correlated with higher false alarm rates. In this case, even we also looked specifically at those false alarms where people had a high confidence. But in both cases, also, if you take all the false alarms, you have these correlations. So that's sort of really in line with the literature. But we don't see any difference here in the active and passive cases. So in both cases, we have very similar correlation. So we would have expected maybe in the active case, you see a much stronger correlation here because those people show a much clearer boost in the active condition. That's not the case. And yeah, it's also mostly related to this decisional effect because actually it also correlated negatively with response bias. So higher scores actually meant also more liberal response bias. Right, so here we saw, okay, action can actually lead to more false percepts compared to a passive condition. It seemed to be more of a decisional thing, more driven by response bias, not really a perceptual sensitivity effect. False alarm rates also correlated with the SPQ, so schizotypy scores, but it was a general correlation, so not really anything specific to action. So action may increase false alarms through decisional processes, or maybe it's related to some kind of sense of agency. But the creation of these false percepts does seem to be due to maybe a problem with general predictive mechanisms and not specific to any efference copy mechanisms in terms of these subclinical symptoms. Right, so what does this all mean? So just to put it all together, I think in the first part of the talk, I talked a lot about this action feedback monitoring, how we detect deviations and how this relates to the self-other distinction. I think here my most important take is that there's actually several processes at play that we can also identify in different brain areas. So we have the cerebellum more as this typical comparator area in terms of forward model processes, but we also have sensory mismatch detection going on, and then an actual processing of hand identity that might help us also decide, is it me or is it not me? And we've seen that in schizophrenia patients, the deficit was very specific to the efference copy part, less to this hand identity part. So this is already showing there is more to this model than just the comparator. There are several processes here at play. It's still maybe a bit of a question how these areas all talk to each other. That's of course hard to really say with fMRI. We can mostly here locate where these processes are. I think other methods should then really try to identify how do these areas all talk to each other and which is most informative for then also getting this whole sense of agency. But that's what we found here. And in the second part, we looked at effects of perception. And here also I had to show that it's not as simple as originally thought. So we see that action often suppresses, but it sometimes leads to enhancement. Stimulus visibility seems to be one of the effects that modulates this affection. It's probably not the only one. I'm pretty sure there's many factors that influence this. I already mentioned a few options, but at least this is the one that we tested here. Action can also shift response bias, so it can also change how we make sensory, like perceptual decisions. That actually leads us to report more false alarms. And these false percepts seem to be then more linked to a general predictive deficit. So people with higher schizophrenia or schizotype scores, they did report more false percept, but it's not really specific to action. It's more a general thing. So just a little outlook of what some are, what of the some of the open questions are for me. Well, first of all, I still want to research more. Why does action sometimes suppress and sometimes enhance? I mean, we have some ideas, right? But I think there's still many more factors that play a role. And I think it's also intuitive that maybe action should not always suppress. I mean, this example of like when I try to like look for my keys in my handbag, actually in that case, I don't want to suppress tactile sensitivity. I actually want to enhance my tactile sensitivity so that I can quickly find the key. So it does make sense, but it would be very interesting to see which factors here do all play a role and how you easily switch between different aspects. Again, this whole idea of like what is specific to an efference copy versus what is just a more general predictive coding effect that we are measuring. Are there maybe also specific difference between the sensory modalities? Vision is sometimes also a bit different than the other modalities, so that's something we're looking into. And also this whole question, how do problems with prediction lead to psychosis? And the first schizophrenia study, it seemed to be clearly an efference copy deficit, but then the schizotype study seemed to be a more general prediction effect, so also more questions to talk about. Right, so with that, I would like to also thank my lab. We're still like a fairly new lab, so I'm really thankful for all the great people that work here and help build this lab. I also want to thank all the collaborators that were involved in the studies that I presented today, and thank you for your attention.
Bianca, thank you so much. This was such an interesting talk, and I want to invite everybody to unmute yourself and let's give Bianca a big applaud. And how would you feel about taking questions?
Of course, yes, happy to.
Okay, great. I have tons, but I'll try to narrow them down. So first of all, I want to ask, I mean, you talked about the controller model and you showed all these components and some of them were like, let's say, modality related and some were not. And I'm wondering because most of the paradigms you showed had to do with hands. And I wonder, for example, in the motor cortex, I would expect that there would be some mapping of the body parts such that it would be different areas corresponding to hands or legs or, whatever. But I don't know, maybe in the angular gyrus you showed, it's more, I don't know, generic in a way, and that maybe you would also find, mapping of the body in the cerebellum. I don't know. I mean, I'm not familiar with the maps in the cerebellum, but I'm wondering if you think that there may be like if you use different parts of the body, then would you see mapping and in different regions? So this is one question. And then another question that I had, and actually the last points that you showed assisted me in elaborating it because you asked why would some enhance and so you were talking about the purpose, that you need, for example, in your purse, you would need more sensitivity. And that also led me to think, is there a purpose to the sensation or is it just, um, epiphenomenal, such as when you move your hand, the thing that you showed, and your sleeve moves. This is, I mean, it's nothing that you really should. It's not part of the goal of your action. But I was thinking also in another dimension about, so all of these were quite subtle actions, nothing is hurtful, nothing is too, extreme. Everything is okay, pressing a button but what if this action is in a way, very unpleasant or to the or maybe very pleasant. So what if there's something very clear about the gains or losses? I mean, gains and losses, that's very unidimensional way of putting it. But what if it has some, consequences that are not just, okay, fine, we're gonna, what if you know that you're going to bump into something and it's going to scratch you or whatever. Or it's going to be, like you have all these teddy bears and all these nice things you want to pat, like I see Roi has a new haircut and I would want to, go over his head like this. So what about, yeah. So what about these kinds of actions that you think that may cause you sensations that you're not indifferent to, whether that would, this is what, okay, so I said I have more, but I'll stop here for now.
Yeah. No, really super interesting question. I think it's also a valid point because a lot of the literature indeed focuses on very, first of all, simple actions. That's also something that we're trying to get away from. So button presses are, of course, nice because you can control them really well and they don't cause a lot of movement in the scanner. But then again, how, it's only one aspect of our whole motor behavior. So that's already one thing. Um, I'm not sure if there's much research on indeed the cost of an action. So I know indeed there's a lot of the actions are um, usually fairly neutral. So it would indeed be like you have a button that would lead to a tone, or it would lead to a visual stimulus, or there's also, for example, suppression of speech when you speak versus you hear yourself on tape, like this kind of effect.
Mhm.
Most of this indeed is just a fairly neutral thing. You cause a stimulus. It is just very neutral. Sometimes you have to do something with the stimulus, sometimes not. That's already one thing that's also not quite consistent. So a lot of these studies were also just looking at how you just passively then perceive the stimulus, but not, you didn't have to judge it. So I think that already makes a difference. But I'm not sure how much there is on this. Yeah, indeed, like the cost of us of
Or gain.
Orgain, yes, yes,
Yeah,
definitely. So I know that a colleague of mine, Eski Arikanchek, I think she wants to do something also in this like emotional valence of like if like if you have to move
yeah.
towards a spider, for example, or something like this, right? So how does this affect also your sensitivity? But I'm not quite sure if there's already any results on this. So it's really, I think it's a fascinating question, and I think that is also one of the aspects that is definitely worth exploring because after all, you constantly also make judgment, right? Though in our experience, of course, the action is predefined. Like you either just have to press a button, we tell them that's the only action you do, or even with the device, you do move your hand back and forth, but it's a predefined trajectory. You can't really do much other than maybe move a bit faster or slower, but that's basic, it's still predefined. So I think it would open up a whole world of like if you really allow people to choose an action and choose how they do it and then look at their perceptual sensitivity, what that does. And I'm not quite sure if there's much work on this. But I could imagine it definitely should play a role. After all, you also make a lot of judgments on like how you execute an action that it costs you the least amount of resources, for example. So you already tried to change your direction, everything. I'm not sure if there's much on this. So it's actually a very, very good question that I don't have an answer to yet.
Yeah, and I
So
just thought, I'm
yeah,
not from the field at all, but I was wondering about that.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and
yeah,
also with the body parts, that was your first question, right? So, like in our case, indeed, we focused mostly on the finger and the hand movements. That was our focus. Of course, there's also lots of eye movement literature on the saccadic suppression as well. Um, I'm not sure if there's much direct comparison. So in terms of the actual effects on sensory regions, I think there is quite some overlap that you can maybe also the effect of eye movements in the visual cortex. There you would also see a suppression, for example. So that is, you can sort of like generalize a lot of these effects. I think there was also some studies on like foot movements and these kind of things. Like usually it tends to be a very similar thing that you have a cerebellum that sort of detects like deviations and you see effects in the sensory cortices. But I'm not sure if there's actually been doing any specific mapping of if you
yeah,
still see
exactly. I mean, it
anything.
would be interesting to see if the foci, with the foot that you're saying or
Yeah,
leg would be similar to the foci, anatomically that
yeah,
that you see in the cerebellum or is, I mean, I'm not familiar with the cerebellum maps at
Yeah,
all,
yeah,
but
sure.
it would be interesting to see if, if there is or there isn't any overlap, if this is some,
Yeah.
generic, hub, like deactivation or desensitization hub in the cerebellum, or if it's some sort of a body map. And even I would say, I mean, you would think of a body map, but again, you're
Mm.
expecting some specific sensation. You're not expecting this to be hot. You're not
Yeah.
expecting it to be, uh, you know, um, spiny or all of these things. So you're expecting the kind of like smooth touch. So maybe this is the sort of specific desensitization, and maybe if you would vary, maybe
Hmm.
even for the finger, if you would vary the expected sensation, wetness, heat, blah blah blah, then you would see some maybe mapping. I don't know. It's
Yeah,
just
I
my
mean,
thoughts are.
related to the specific stimulus features, there's some work also from my colleagues in Gießen, like Katja Fieler, for example. She had tactile suppression where they also varied like the actual vibration frequency
Mm,
of the
uh-huh.
stimulus. And
Yeah.
there they found indeed that at least the behavioral suppression is very specific to the frequency that you're expecting. So if it's suddenly then not congruent, then you do see less of the suppression effect. So there's also something about the stimulus features
Mm,
that is sort of encoded in this prediction. But I'm not sure if that also translates in terms of like, for example, what the cerebellum does. If it's just like one hub that just encodes any type of spatial deviation or like any deviation with your prediction, or if there's also smaller like specific prediction
subtle.
sort
Yeah.
of differentiate from each other. I'm not quite sure if there's anything on that. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Roi, I see you unmuted yourself. So does that mean you have a question? I
Yeah,
mean,
no,
should
I
it?
just wanted to add. So with respect to effectors, we showed that sensory regions actually code. We did not check hand versus foot, but we did check right hand versus left hand. And you can decode based on visual signal, visual evoked responses in visual cortex. You can decode the hand that was used, left or right.
Oh, wow. And what about
Uh,
motor? And in motor cortex, would you see right and left,
so in motor
contralateral?
cortex, so that's expected in motor
Yeah,
cortex.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm not saying
But
it's
the
not.
flip side, and regarding your question about reward, is that changes in rewards or in sensory outcome can change actually the kinetics of the actual movement.
Mm,
So it changes the efference copies in a sense.
yeah. I mean, we are talking about different copies, but there's no real, like, I would say, I mean, this is a concept, right? We're not really sure that even exists or how it even exists or what is I mean, we
Well,
know, like, right?
well, there are
Completely wrong.
omission studies where you press a button, there's a sound, you press a button, there's a sound, and now you press a button, there's no sound. You still see an auditory evoked signal.
Mm,
Uh, that's the closest
that
in
they,
human,
okay.
non-invasively in humans.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. I also have another question. Well, if others have questions, feel free to. I want to ask about the angular gyrus and also when you showed additional maps. I mean, I am wondering how close it is to the default mode network because it looked like, I mean, I wasn't sure. I mean, the border between parietal and the default mode is like very, but I was wondering, and then when you showed the whole big network, I don't remember which slide that was. I think that was the controls versus, or the neurotypicals versus the schizophrenic. Maybe I'm wrong. But anyway, it also seemed like a few of the locations were kind of like similar to the default mode, not all of them. So I wonder if you think it's just adjacent or if it's somewhat participating in that or breaking down. Maybe the default mode has different components, which some are related to this and some are different. So,
Yeah.
Is it only one side? At least from the maps that I saw.
mm,
Right. So we in the very first study with the button presses, where we also had unimodal, visual, and bimodal and everything. There we also did do some connectivity analyses between angular gyres and then see where in the rest of the brain it is. There it did seem that it is connected to some of more these like default mode network areas. So I'm not sure if like angular gyres was specifically that region was specifically part of it, but at least it was connected to some of the regions that are generally like thought to be on this whole self-referential thing. So that also would of course make sense if it's really about like, is it me or is it someone else? Like, am I sort of monitoring like if this is really my own action, that it makes sense that it's sort of connected to these areas. So at least in terms of connectivity, we did see that there's some relationship there.
Interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Bianca, thank you so much for this really interesting talk. And again, thank you so much for joining and for sharing your exciting research with us. And yeah, and I also want to thank everybody else for joining. And we are actually very close to finishing this series of this year, but on the 14th of July, not related to any country birthday, but anyway, we're going to have Sam Schwarzkopf from New Zealand join us, which is just, I can't believe he's going to be, yeah. So we're very fortunate to finally, but that's going to be in a while. So we will be hosting all the information, but yeah, have a lovely summer, cool summer, a nice rest of the week. And thank you again, Bianca, for the lovely talk. Thank you.
Thank you as well. Have a good summer, everyone.
Thank you.